Hey guys, welcome to week 2 of our November Art and Chill series where we're taking a look at stylizing our characters beyond realism. Last week we took a regular portrait and stylized it to look more unique and appealing. Today we're going to do the same thing for the human body, but actually I'm going to show you a few different variations on both the male and female body. We're going to take a look at first building a super quick body concept for both male and female characters, and then I'm going to walk you through a couple of different ways you can make male and female characters more masculine and more feminine. And towards the end, we'll maybe take a look at aging down the body to look more youthful and childlike for your younger characters. Again, we'll be using a lot of symmetry today, so make sure your painting program supports that function. But whenever you're ready, grab your stylus and let's dive right in. So today I kind of want to work on a couple of different body types, and I say a couple, but we're actually going to look at like 5 or 6. So what we're going to look at is the basic male, female, and your stylized, I don't know how you spell stylized, you're going to have your masculine male, your slightly more feminine male, you're going to have your feminine female body, and you're going to have your slightly more masculine female body. And I say masculine, feminine in the traditional sense of the word. So yeah, and then we're actually going to look at how you can vary these, the basic male and female bodies, to get a more, let's say, a child's body or a more youthful body. So let's start with the very basics, alright? So I'm going to create a new layer and turn on vertical symmetry. Right, so let's start with the female body, alright? Because that is the more complex one, and then with the male one it gets a little easier. But let's start with the toughest one. So I always like to have a center line, and the great thing about doing this digitally is you can, use symmetry and basically only draw half the concept. So I always like to start with a simple circle for the top of the skull, bring down the jaw on either side, and then meet it or join the two sides in the center, where you have your chin, maybe draw in an ear, just because, and then bring a couple of lines down for the neck, and maybe widen them out a little bit for the shoulder. Now, I generally do this for every single character I ever paint, so like I kind of know what I'm doing purely out of practice. But if this is something new to you and you're not very comfortable drawing human bodies from scratch, you can always get yourself some references off of Pinterest and apply these to kind of the structure that we're about to create. So first things first, once I've gotten to this stage, I want to kind of think of the rib cage, all right? And the way I like to okay, so it's a little weird, but the way I like to indicate the torso is through a shape that I like to call the Pope's hat. And it's basically, you're gonna bring a couple of lines down and then further straight down and tilt them in, almost like you're making a kite of some sort. But then at the waist, you kind of want to bring it up into like an arc, like a rainbow, and meet it in the center. Do you see what I mean about it looking like the Pope's hat? So this is kind of a rough guide for our rib cage and torso, and obviously this narrowest point is going to be our waist, all right? And we'll look at the arms in just a second, but for now I kind of want to go just a little bit under the waist and maybe do 2 little diagonals like this, and that's going to be our indicator for the hips. Now technically the hips are like this butterfly shape, but I find that just this is good enough for me. But if you feel the need to, elaborate on the actual shape itself, feel free. But this is just a quick and easy way that I tend to do it. So now we have our torso and hips, and now let's look at the limbs. Let's start with the legs. Now, with the legs, you have your thigh region, your knee, and your calf. Now this can become a little stiff, right? And stiffness is just not natural, and we don't generally want to go there, because even if it's not going to be in, oh, that was loud. Even if it's not going to be in the final painting, you still kind of want a little bit of fluidity even in your concept, purely because it puts you in the right mindset, right? If you have something stiff that you're working on, your mind kind of gets into that mold of, this is stiff and I'm gonna think stiff, and it's, yeah, okay, anyway. I could waffle on and on, but the way I like to indicate my limbs, at least in my concept, is through kind of like a pointy S shape. So you have a kind of convex curve for the thigh muscle, and it's gonna come in, and then you're gonna have a concave curve for the calf muscle. This looks a little insane, but once you have this kind of almost sickle shape, right? I think this is a bit too far. We can then counterbalance it, build out the thighs on both sides, create a kneecap, and then build the lower leg around it, and boom, you have your lower limbs. And for the foot, I generally like to do like a open triangle for the toe region, and then just bring this line of the calf down into like an L shape to meet this, and you have your feet. So this is your quadriceps muscles, your hamstrings in here, your calves, and your knees, and it's honestly just that simple. So similarly with the arms, but for the arms we're gonna have to do one extra kind of curve. So we have these lines, these are basically our traps, our trapezius muscles. I also like to sometimes indicate the collarbones, which is just a little line in the center that meets this outer edge of the trapezius, just so it kind of gives me a meeting point to start the shoulder from. So for the shoulder, you're gonna have just a pretty simple C curve. Now, in traditionally feminine female bodies, you don't have very big muscles in, either the arms or the legs. Generally, the female body is a lot softer. It's not built for strength as much as the male body is, like in terms of physical torque and lifting and that kind of thing. The female body is a little more, soft and curved and, that kind of stuff. So while you do have muscle, it's not massive, bulky muscle like you'd see in a very traditionally male body. So with our curves, we're not going, crazy big, right? We want to keep it fairly simple. So we have a little bit of a curve for the shoulder. We're going to bring that in, and then about just around the waist is kind of where you have your elbow, right? If you stand up straight, or if you straighten your arm down right now, you'll notice your elbow is just around, if not slightly under, the narrowest part of your waist. Okay, and then from here, because we've taken it in on this curve, we're just gonna take it out and down on this curve, and you want to end just above the midline of the thigh. All right, and then we're gonna have to counterbalance, right? So we're gonna pull the inside of the armpit, we're gonna build out the bicep on this side, and then maybe add a little bit of extra mass on the inside of the forearm. Bring both these lines down and meet at the wrist. The way I like to indicate hands, very simple, just a little bloop, like a little angle that follows down from the wrist, and then another one here for the thumb. And then I just like to do a little V down there. And elongate this if you need to, if you feel like the fingers look too weird. And finally, we're just gonna connect the torso and the hip. And there you go. There's your basic skeletal female body. Now you could add a bit of a curve for the breast, and I like to usually keep this, it kind of starts right up there and forms like a upside down heart shape and ends at the top of this rainbow that we sketched in, right? And that's kind of a very basic female body. Now, if you feel like some areas are too short or too long, you can always, go back in and fix it up. But again, remember, this is purely for our concepting purposes, so it's not going to be ultra realistic, right? So don't worry too much about getting it perfect and believable or anything like that, because that's not our goal for this. Right? Our goal is to kind of give us a mannequin to work off of, so we can maybe start thinking about costumes next week. So for now, this is pretty good in terms of like a general female body. Let's take a look at a general basic male body now. So to start with, I'm actually gonna put this layer into a new group and call it F. Ooh, that's not an F. All right. Just so all of our female bodies can go into that folder, and I'm gonna make it invisible, make a new layer on top. All right, so let's go ahead and start working on our basic traditionally masculine male body. All right, so with the male body, the first thing to remember is that men obviously tend to be taller than women do, and even if they're not, physically tall per se, I mean, like, they don't need to be 6'12", but generally speaking, the male face takes up a lot smaller proportion of the entire body. So whereas here we had the female face maybe taking up about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about a sixth of the height, the male face will generally be about a seventh or an eighth of the height. All right, so again, we're going to start with our basic circle, but this time we're going to remember that we want to keep it quite small. All right, so the head is proportionally less of the total height. I hope that makes sense. All right, and 9 times out of 10, the male jaw tends to be a lot more squared off, a lot more chiseled. And you'll see that this is a running theme in more masculine bodies, is everything is more squared off and chiseled and sharper. Whereas in the more feminine bodies, you'll see that everything is a lot softer and rounder, So again, we're going to pull a line down on either side for the neck. And this is, again, I keep saying this over and over, but I love symmetry for this exact reason, is because we're basically only drawing one half and it kind of builds up the other half for us. The beauties of digital painting. Now, this is where our very first difference comes in the male versus the female body, because the male body is gonna have a stronger trapezius muscle, whether or not the person, the subject, is super bulky. The female trapezius muscle generally tends to be a lot smaller than the male one, even if it isn't bulky trapezius in the male. Just the height of it and the width of it just tends to be quite bigger than the female equivalent. So we're gonna have to build that down a little bit. And so this time when we bring the collarbone out, we have almost like a bigger angle. So you see this angle here in the female body, you see it's a lot smaller, right? So now from here, we're gonna do the Pope's hat thing again, but this time we're gonna make it a little more angular. So instead of taking a curve down like this, we're actually gonna build it to be a little broader and more angular. And so this time when we bring it down, we don't want the rainbow to go that far up either, all right? And that's because the male rib cage tends to be a lot broader and a lot deeper than the female rib cage. Again, it's just, you know, human anatomy. The male body is built more for endurance and hunting, gathering, that kind of thing. And so they need a lot more lung volume and a lot bigger kind of heart volume. And so the rib cage kind of has to be big and broad and deeper to kind of accommodate for that. So that's why you'll see a more kind of stretched out rib cage as compared to the female rib cage, which was a lot more curved in at the waist, you know, and at the collarbone, you know, it narrows in at the collarbone. Whereas here, you don't have quite so much of a curve. However, the thing to remember is that the male body, that was loud and rude and no thank you. The male body tends to be a lot more top heavy in the sense of it tends to be broader at the shoulder, not so much at the hips. Female body tends to have wider hips. Why? Because, you know, it's going to have to give birth, biologically speaking. I mean, obviously you don't have to give birth, but generally speaking, that's what your body is made for in terms of biology. So that's why you have like a wider hip in the female, right? Whereas with the male, you're not going to have that curve because the male doesn't have to give birth. So... Ooh. Sorry about that. My computer got loud. So, generally speaking, the male body tends to follow almost like a V shape, where it's quite broad at the shoulder, but the hips aren't proportional. So, instead of having these big old, almost discs, I want to call them, we're actually going to have them a lot narrower and a lot deeper, because just like the rib cage, the male pelvis tends to be deeper as well, but not as broad. So it's just going to be like a narrower V shape and maybe meat in the center, right? And then this time, when it comes to putting the curves in for the legs, as in the thigh and the calf, we're gonna have to go a little deeper, a little broader, because again, the male body is technically made for, you know, hard labor, for movement and you're picking up things, hunter-gatherer, that kind of thing. So this time we're actually gonna really pull the curve out and bring it all the way in. And with the calf especially, the calf muscle in a traditionally masculine body is built quite big. And then we're gonna bring it all the way down. Now this looks a little insane. It looks a little wobbly, a little Squidward, but don't worry. So we're now gonna counterbalance. So we're gonna pull the hamstring in a little more, maybe build out this muscle, have our kneecap here, and then with the calf, I think we went a little too crazy, but you know, men do be a little crazy. So do women. I look down on humans equally, including myself. So, okay, wow, everyone is big honking today. So, again, a little open triangle for the foot. Bring the heel down in like an L shape. Maybe build a little more bulk just around the knee. And maybe a little more in the thigh as well. Right? And if, you know, the person is quite well built or quite skinny, you'll generally also see a bit of a hip V. I think these are so attractive. Side note, unrelated to everything we're doing, when, you know, men have that hip V. Whew. So anyway, we're just gonna we're just gonna build this up, right? And same thing with the arm, is you want to have a much bigger deltoid, right? And a much deeper curve for the bicep. Meet again, you have your elbow just around the narrowest part of the waist. Bring it back out for the forearm, and again, it's gonna counterbalance. You're gonna have a stronger little musculature around the armpit area, right? A bigger tricep at the back. Bulk out this bicep. Right, so this will be the tricep, and this is going to be the bicep, and this is the forearm muscle. Again, making it a lot bigger, a lot deeper than we did with the female body. And again, with the hand, you can just, hands are just, no. It doesn't matter how long you've been drawing for, it doesn't matter how good you are at it, hands will never be fun. So, okay, I feel like the rib cage is a little too narrow, so I'm actually gonna pull it out a bit more, just to really balance out the bulk of that shoulder. And finally, instead of the breast, here we have a pectoral muscle, right? So that's just basically like a bar of chocolate. Today on Analogies with Srish. Amazing. So anyway, so it's basically just two little blocks like that, and then it goes all the way up to the collarbone, and that is your traditionally male body. Now I feel like the legs are a little so I'm just gonna build them to be a little narrower at the knee, a little less crazy, right? And so that is our more masculine base body. Now let's take a look at maybe stylizing both of these. So again, I'm gonna make a new group, call it M, and let's first start by stylizing the masculine body, just because, you know, we're here already. So I'm actually gonna create a new layer on top and lower the opacity of our initial sketch. Now let's think about making some tweaks. So we know that the way the male body differs from the female is you have a broader shoulder, you have a bigger, bulkier muscle, you have narrower hips, and you have a strong, you know, pectoral girdle, you have a strong trapezius, all of that kind of thing. Let's now think about really pushing that difference. If you want to make a manly body look even more manly, even more chiseled and defined and that kind of thing, how are we going to do that? Well, the first thing we're going to do is exaggerate, right? So we're really going to make the shoulders super bulky, super broad, really pull out the arm, keeping maybe the rib cage the same width, maybe a little bit wider. And we're gonna meet this up on an even bulkier trapezius. Now, obviously this is not gonna be something you sell as realistic, obviously. This is more maybe a kind of Hulk type character, all right? So barbarian, that kind of character design. So again, building the bicep out. Generally speaking, the bicep is a show muscle, so even if, you know, someone is super strong, the bicep is only going to get so big. Your maximum bulk generally comes from the muscles in the back, whereas all the muscles in the front are like show muscles, and so people with like an 8-pack might not be as strong as people with a very strong back but a bit of a gut, you know. So if you look at bodybuilders versus weight lifters, oh my god, I forgot what they were called, weightlifters, you'll see that they are built quite differently in that the weightlifters tend to have a lot of bulk on the back, right? And so that's something to consider when you're designing your characters. So anyway, you're gonna have these muscles from the back kind of showing through. These are your lats, your latissimus dorsi, and they are gonna kind of show through from behind the rib cage. You're gonna have a stronger forearm, and because we have that initial sketch underneath, we don't have to start with, you know, building the rib cage and building the hip bones or anything like that. But here, another way to really push it is to make the hips even narrower. And that way, you're really pushing that contrast of how broad the shoulders are. So, again, bring the neck down. Maybe from here, you have a very, very bulky thigh. Super, super bulky, right? And like I said, the male muscle tends to bulk up really easily, whereas the female muscle, no matter how hard you work it, it's generally not gonna get this big naturally. So a lot of the times people will, you know, take whey protein or steroids, that kind of thing, to really bulk up the female muscle. It just doesn't bulk up as easily as the male muscle does. So that's something to keep in mind. As someone who's been desperately trying to get a lot more muscle bulk, it doesn't work, and I can't be bothered to really go that far to actually get it. So, phew, sorry. Whew. That one came out of nowhere. So anyway, have a fair bit of bulk on the thigh. And obviously the knee is a bone surrounded by connective tissue, so that's not going to bulk up, is it? However, the calf. Now, when, you know, a bodybuilder or whoever works out, the calf muscle is just one of those that doesn't really bulk up unless you work it in very specific ways. So you'll see that maybe bodybuilders don't have as much of a calf muscle unless they specifically do calf raises, they do running. Runners, on the other hand, have these massive calves. So if you really want to push that, you know, very primal barbarian type thing, you really want to push the calf muscles to be super big as well. And it kind of gives you the impression that not only does this person lift heavy, they also run a lot, and that just kind of fits in with the whole like going to war type deal. So you can really push it, and you can also add like a bit of a sharper angle down here, and that way the bulk is so heavy that it's kind of pulling down a little bit. And then you can bring it to a much narrower ankle. The way to push stylization, especially in body types, is to really push the contrast. So it's not just that you have a broad shoulder, you need to give it some context with a very narrow hip. And it's not just that you have a strong calf muscle, you need to give it context with a narrow ankle and a narrow knee. You know, so whenever you're stylizing something, do not draw in a vacuum, if that makes sense at all. Do not draw just, you know, as is. Don't just tack on some extra shoulders to a basic male form. You want to make sure that the rest of the body is further pushing that contrast. All right, so if I just, so this was what we started with, and this is what we have. So if I just move this to one side and reveal this one as well, do you see the massive difference? This one almost, the bulky one almost looks shorter even. And that's probably because we didn't give him a head. So let's give him a head. But even so, you'll see that the relative proportions kind of change everything. So let me just, so there we go. Now he has a head. But even so, do you see what I said about the head taking up a lot less of the body height? And so when you really push that width, it, you know, makes it even more extreme. All right, so now let's look at maybe doing the opposite, so maybe feminizing the male body a little bit. All right, so I'm just gonna do the same thing that we did, create a new layer on top, lower the opacity of the original, and let's take a look at how we can make this a little less traditionally masculine. All right, just because I want to cover all of our bases. So we're gonna start with, you know, leaving the head alone, maybe narrowing the jaw just a little bit, just softening it out a little. All right, now first indicator of manliness is that trapezius, right? So we can make it a little smaller, a little less bulky, maybe soften out the collarbone just a little bit. And the more kind of rounded shapes you use, the more feminized something looks. So that's not me saying it, that's society saying it. Don't come at me, please. I love all kinds of things, but yeah, I'm talking about in terms of stereotypes, right? So, and the reason we kind of paint in stereotypes is because they are recognizable. So if you want your character to have a very specific story behind it, can you stop interrupting me, please? That's very, wow. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but someone's just honking really loudly. Anyway, so the reason when you have characters and you want to, you know, portray a very specific story, you kind of want to play into the stereotypes a little bit, but also then kind of subvert expectations, if that makes sense. So if I want a character to look a little less masculine, I'm gonna maybe give them leaner muscle and narrower shoulders and so on, and then maybe give them like a deadly weapon, which is traditionally masculine, so, you know, something like that. But anyway, so we're gonna play into the stereotype a little bit today, just so you guys kind of have a handle on how you can make something appealing in very specific ways, right? So the collarbone, and we're gonna narrow the shoulders a little bit. So again, you want it to be broader than what would traditionally be a feminine shoulder, but at the same time, you don't want it to be super bulky. So this time, when we create our muscles, we're gonna keep them nice and long, but we're not gonna bulk them too much, right? So, like I said, the biceps tend to be show muscles, so they're probably not gonna be super big, right? The triceps carry a little bit of bulk, but again, we want to keep it fairly lean With the chest, you can maybe soften out that angle, make it a little narrower, right? And again, keeping in mind that we still want it to look like a male body, but just not as crazy bulky, right? So we're still gonna have, you know, visible pectorals and a broader shoulder, but we don't want it to be super broad either. You probably won't see very much trapezius or anything like that, and we can actually soften out this angle and make the hips a little wider this time, and that way we're basically countering what we've done with both the male bodies so far, where we narrowed the hips. This time we're actually broadening the hips out, making it all a little softer, maybe make the legs quite lean, you know, quite sedentary almost. And that's not me throwing shade at anyone. I'm sedentary as all hell. My legs be like, oh. So don't even come at me. But I'm saying, you know, maybe this is a body that doesn't do as much heavy lifting. Maybe he's a runner. Maybe he is a yoga type person. I've been into yoga lately, which, by the way, I'm just making the legs a little narrower. But yeah, I've been doing yoga lately because my body has been like dying from all the heavy workout. And I don't know if it's just me, but it's been triggering my misophonia quite a bit, which is where like sounds trigger you. I don't know why. Maybe it's like quieting my mouth. It's quieting my mind down a bit too much, and now everything feels like 10 times louder. Again, we're gonna make the forearm a little more delicate, really push the narrowness of that wrist, and maybe have the hands be a little lanky as well. I think that shoulder is a little too bulked up still, so I'm just gonna, instead of having like a arch up here, I'm actually just gonna pull it down, right? And that is our more lean guy. So if I put him next to the original, you'll see that he's a lot more slender, a lot more, you know, a lot less what you would say is like a man. And then if we put him next to like a crazy bulky guy, the difference is pretty obvious. So that is, you know, a couple different ways to stylize the male body. Let's take a look at stylizing the female body. Okay, you guys, so update. When I was trying to film the second half of this video, we had a big power cut, and the power wasn't back until like a few hours after, and I wasn't really able to finish it on that day. And this is the only time I have to film it, but it is quite late, and we're still just, you know, at the tail end of Diwali, so if you hear any fireworks in the back, I'll try my best to kind of get rid of them. But if you hear like random explosions, it's India. But anyway, so let's go ahead and try out the technique of maybe broadening or slimming certain aspects to see if we can make a female figure more feminine and more masculine. So we're gonna start just like we did with the male. We're gonna start with the base figure that we created at the very beginning of this video, and I'm actually gonna lower the opacity quite a bit and create a new layer on top. and going back in with the pencil brush, let's start by making her look a little more feminine, right? So the neck is going to be pretty much the same, right? But for the traps, we're actually going to take it even softer and even rounder. And we're going to make the shoulders a lot narrower and a lot softer, right? So you can see there's a noticeable difference. I'm actually going to keep the breast area the same size just to show you that, you know, breasts are not what make a female figure feminine. And we're going to keep the waist the same as well, all right? Bringing this arm down, we're going to try and lose a little bit of that muscle tone. Make her arms a lot more slender. Same with the forearm. A lot more slender, a lot more delicate. And this is just really pushing the traditional understanding of what it means to be feminine, I suppose. And where possible, I'm turning all the angles into curves. And that's another little subtle way to make something look more feminine and more softer, is to round off all of the angles possible. All right, so with the waist, we've kept it the same. But one key indicator of femininity is that it is opposite to traditional masculinity. And so because male bodies tend to be top heavy, as in wide shoulders, we're going to go the opposite way and actually give her quite wide hips. Now, wide hips are generally quite common in women because childbearing, you have to literally push another human out of your hip area. So nature has pretty much taken care of that by giving women hips that are quite wide, much wider than a male hip. So, well, proportionally speaking, of course. So we're gonna really push that wide circumference for the hip, and maybe really round out the thighs as well. So we're basically making the female body bottom heavy, right? And again, keeping the calves quite narrow and slender. But when we emphasize the lower body like that, it tends to, well, one, obviously take it away from masculinity, but two, it tends to make the body feel a little more grounded, and that to me really sells femininity, because statistically speaking, women tend to be shorter than, you know, their male counterparts, right? And so when you have something that's quite bottom heavy, it makes you feel like the center of gravity has shifted further down. There's our first firework. So that kind of really helps to sell the femininity of it all. With the jaw, I'm actually going to make it a little softer and rounder, maybe narrower at the chin area, but keep the rest of the head the same. And again, that's another subtle way to really push like the roundedness of it all. So that's our female, well, feminine female form. So if I just move this to the side, ooh, wrong layer, that happens so often. If I just move this to the side and move her to one side, you can see the clear difference. So the original body appears to be a lot more athletic, a lot more toned and hard-edged with like strong plane shifts, whereas the one we just sketched tends to look a little more soft and rounded, and obviously the arms are a little wonky. I might go back and fix that later, but you get the gist, right? So let's now go to the other extreme. So I'm going to hide that layer, create another layer, And let's now try and make this body a lot more masculine, more muscular. So you can probably guess by this point the changes we're gonna make, because it's pretty much the same changes we made with the male body. But let's start right at the top, and we can start by really squaring off that jaw, really widening it. And you know, when it comes to designing a character, especially when it comes to choosing the anatomy of your character, it is so important to look at every single aspect on it and make sure that every part of this character is really selling your story. So because we're going for a more masculine female character here, we're gonna definitely take a look from head all the way down to toes, right? So you want a thicker neck as well, maybe some traps. Again, we don't want this to literally turn into a male body, so we are going to keep some aspects of the original. So even though we have these trap muscles, we're not really going to build them out like we did for the masculine characters. Collarbones can be a little more angular, and the shoulder muscle can come out wider. Now, here is the trick, is we can't really change the bone structure too much, because like I said, you know, biology, there's only so far you can push it and still have it believable. Now, obviously, if you're working in terms of caricatures, you can really push the proportions and really stylize them. But if you're trying to sell a more realistic, believable character, but still want it to be slightly stylized and slightly exaggerated, you want to think bone structure, can't touch it. What can you change in real life? What can you change about your body? You can change the musculature, you can change the fat accumulation and things like that. So that's what we're gonna look at changing today. Again, you can push it far as you want to, but I want to get you guys familiar and comfortable with the basics so you can then start with this and then build on it. So anyway, apparently we're in a very chatty mood today. I'm hoping this half of the video doesn't turn out super long. But with the arms, we're really gonna push the musculature. Now, generally speaking, with just exercise, the female body doesn't necessarily bulk up as easily, right? It generally takes a lot of supplements, a lot of concentrated weight training and that kind of thing, a lot of dietary changes in order for the female body to show this much muscle. So that's something to keep in mind, is that it's not naturally, you know, common, is what I'm trying to say. It's not common for the female body to bulk up like that. So when you see such muscle on a female frame, it tends to kind of throw you off and make your character instantly noticeable, because it's not something we see very commonly, right? And if you really want to push that and really grab attention, you want to push that juxtaposition of what is expected of the female body and what you're seeing here. And the best way to do that is to bring some elements of a traditionally feminine form back in here. So, for instance, like I said, the bone structure can't be changed. So we're gonna actually bring some of that narrow, delicate, feminine aspect in the joints, because we don't really have muscles at our joints. We have bones meeting each other, right? So you can't really bulk up at the joints themselves. And that's where we can throw in a little bit of maybe delicateness, if that's the word. And then bring back some bulk again in the forearm muscles, but then go super narrow right at the wrist, and maybe have a bit of angularity in the hands rather than going soft and round. So again, most popular ways that you show masculinity and femininity is through the angles and the curves. Something that's more soft and rounded is going to appear more feminine and youthful. Something that is squared off is going to appear more mature. And something triangular is going to appear more dangerous and dynamic. So we want to kind of create a bit of a balance. So even with the breast here, instead of going for a nice rounded curve, I think I want to go a little angular. I think we can get away with that, right? So it is a traditionally feminine anatomical aspect, but we are masculinizing it. So what we want to do is, instead of having this hourglass shape, we're actually going to build the waist out so it's a lot straighter. Maybe add a little bit of musculature and make the hips proportionally narrower. So we don't want to push it out like that, because that again is very feminine, right? So we're going to keep the hips relatively narrow as compared to the waist, and we're really going to build musculature without that fatty deposit in the thigh area. So you'll probably see a lot of hard corners in the hamstring area and the thigh area, because you don't have that layer of fat that softens and rounds everything out. Now, in a female body, it's actually very difficult to get proper musculature around the hip and thigh area. Your body kind of tends to want to store fat in those areas. So when you use very hard muscle in a female character in the lower body, the implication is usually bodybuilder. You know, it's not very easy to build pure muscle and no fat in the lower body. So keep that in mind if you create a female character with very strong leg musculature. That's kind of the implication, is that they are probably a bodybuilder. Now the calf muscle, I pulled it out a bit too much, but I think the calf is another one of those muscles. It is hard to build them even in a male body, which builds muscle relatively easily. So in order to have a big calf in a female body, that's going to take a lot of work. So something to keep in mind. Again, it's just implications are based on stereotypes usually. So if you want your art to break stereotypes, then go for it. But if you want to conform to them and use familiar imagery, this is kind of what's gonna happen. Okay, so there's our super muscular lady. Is it bad that she is totally my type? So if we pull her to one side and pull the original to the other side, there we go. You can see how while we were drawing, we weren't really making super drastic changes, but when you put it side by side to a fairly average looking female body, you can see that it's a completely different effect. So that's our basics to making something look more masculine and more feminine. Let's now take a look at maybe aging down the body to create kind of like a child character. So when it comes to a child character, in my head, that's around between 5 and 9 years old. I know that's a big window in terms of development, but anything beyond that, you're starting to tread into more teenage or tweenage territory, which the body types start to differentiate a little between the male and female children. But anything below the age of about 9 or 8, the male and female body tends to pretty much be the same, apart from, you know, characteristics that we voluntarily change, like hair length and clothing style and that kind of thing. But when it comes to the body itself, the differentiation only really happens, as in terms of proportions, the differentiation only really happens around just before puberty. So for our purposes today, let's look at a very young child, right? And the way I like to think of it is basically a feminine male body, but slightly different in terms of height. So you know how I said in the male body, the head is quite small and then the body is quite tall in proportion. And then in the female body, the head takes up a little more of the height. And so, you know, that's how you kind of tell that the female body tends to be shorter than the male body. Wow, that's a little honking. With a child, it's even further pushed. So the head is pretty much gonna be about like a fifth of the entire body's height, right? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So let's start by kind of placing the head, all right? And we're gonna create a skull that is quite similar to a female head, and that means the jaw is going to be quite rounded and soft. But the thing to remember is that the jaw isn't going to be long like this quite yet. That happens as the child grows, but most of the times with babies and very young children, you have a very tiny bit of gap between the nose and the chin, right? Most of the gap comes in the upper half of the face. So, well, not upper half, I guess. It's upper 2/3 at that point. So with a face that has a big circular area and a smaller jaw area, we can then pull the neck down. And again, depending on the age and things like that, your neck will probably be very short in like a toddler. And then as they grow, it kind of starts to elongate and everything starts to get bigger and longer. So that's something to keep in mind. With the rib cage, we're pretty much going to do the same thing we did for the more feminine male body. So we're not going full Pope hat. We're actually gonna keep it quite soft and gentle in terms of the angles, right? And we're not gonna have a very big arch either. And again, you want to remember that the head is going to be proportionally quite big. So with the rib cage, you don't want it to be too tall. All right. And then with the hips, again, we're going to keep it quite narrow. The hips, especially in female bodies, they only tend to kind of widen out around teenage, late teenage, that kind of age. So in a very young child, you're probably not going to see a very wide hip, right? And then you have your legs, and for now I'm mostly just placing them. We'll go into the shapes and the limbs in just a second, but again, everything is going to be very soft and gentle and short, at least relatively speaking. Even with very tall children, you can still tell they are children because proportionally speaking, you know, as compared to the head, the bodies tend to be quite short, right? Okay, so that's kind of the basic heights all in place. And with children, I find that this early skeleton helps me a lot instead of, you know, going from head to toe and placing the arms and then the body and then the legs, because this way I kind of know where everything is going and then I can start building around it. So collarbones going to be very soft, rarely visible in children unless they're quite skinny. I was a very skinny child, so you can see my collarbones, you can see my spine, so that's just to say sometimes you can see these bones, but you're gonna have very soft trapezius muscles and narrow shoulders, but the relative height of the arm, a relative length rather, is going to be the same. So it will bend at around waist height. That's around where you'll see the elbow, and then you have your forearm. But because this is quite narrow anyway, we don't need to really pull the wrist in because you don't really have very bulky muscles in the forearm. So the wrists don't look especially delicate. And hands, everything is going to be quite soft. And even if you do want to add angles, make sure they're not very sharp angles. You want a softer kind of curvy L-shape angle, right? And with the chest, again, you don't really have any boobage or anything, so it's mostly just pectoral muscles coming down. Sometimes you can see the ribs, sometimes you can't. Depends on so many different things. But again, we're not going to narrow the waist too much, we're not going to widen the hips out very much, and we're not going to add too much bulk or muscle to the legs either. Everything is quite soft and narrow. Think of it like a deflated adult body. I know how that sounds. I'm not talking about it being like shriveled in the skin or anything. I mean in terms of the proportions, right? It's almost like if you were to inflate this body, it would like fill out and form a very masculine or very feminine body, right? So anyway, coming down to the knees, to the feet, you know, just cleaning up some of the lines. And there is your child's body. And as compared to a grown adult body, do you see how much more of the body is just head? So if I were to scale this to kind of have the head be a similar height as in the adult face, you'll see just how much smaller the body actually is, right? And that's how you tell that it is a child's body. So there is some ways you can, you know, stylize the human body, start with a pretty average base and then build around it. I find that that's the technique that works best for me when I'm concepting human bodies and human characters, especially when it comes to costume and things like that. So I hope this video has helped you guys, and yeah, next week we'll start to design some costumes. I don't know about you, but I love concepting our bodies and playing around with proportions like this, and I hope by the end of this video you've fallen in love with it too. Please make sure you save this week's concepts, because next week we're going to take one of these body types and run with it and try to put some clothes on it. But until then, I'm super excited to see how your body concepts have turned out today, so please take a second to come show me over on Discord. You can share it in the channel called Tutorial Art Share. Thank you so very much for drawing with me today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and I'll see you next week where we channel our inner Edna mode. I'll see you then. Bye guys.